Welcome to Psychoanalysis course, Studies in Hysteria, Preliminary Communication 5. Namaste. Having rolled out a perspective on psychoanalysis and Freud, today we start with Freud's work, Studies in Hysteria with focus on preliminary communication. Guide and discussion is psychoanalysis consultant Dr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
How do we locate preliminary communication in Freud's writings? And what is preliminary communication?
Yeah. Well, first is interesting part is the time. We are looking at earliest of the early Freud. This is 1893, 1895. And the interesting part is, at this point, Freud was in touch with Charcot and Breuer. And these writings, studies on hysteria, actually much of it is the work of Freud and Breuer together. And you will see this preliminary communication comes out as a part of the first Freud publication, Studies on Hysteria. And Studies on Hysteria was largely done by Freud and Breuer together. Preliminary communication is something that both of them have written together. And this is followed by cases on hysteria. So if you look at Studies in Hysteria as a publication, you have the preface, which both of them have written, and very interestingly, both of them have written independently, one paragraph each. They don't co-write a paragraph, which means the differences were simmering right from day one between Breuer and Freud. So if you look at the preface of Studies in Hysteria, very interestingly, we have one paragraph by Breuer and one paragraph by Freud. There is no joint. Similarly, then after the preface, you have preliminary communication. After preliminary communication, you have Studies in Hysteria, 5 studies. And interestingly, the first 2 are jointly by Freud and Breuer. Then from 3rd onwards, it's largely Freud, and then something by Breuer. And then again we have writing by Freud and something by Charcot. So it's a very interesting thing, the way Freud slowly emerges independently. So this is largely a joint production, partly Freud coming on to his own. And if we look at the cases, often we say Anna O was the first of Freud's case, but actually it's a joint case. It is the 3rd case, Lucy, that actually is the first Freud's independent published case in that sense. Now, what preliminary communication does is it introduces us to what Breuer and Freud were doing. And it tries to theorize to some extent in a proto way on the analysis of how hysteria happens, the etiology, and how they have successfully healed, in some cases, hysteria. So preliminary communication in that sense is a space where all the fundamental principles of psychoanalysis we find in their proto form. And this is very important. And we also see how the language of psychoanalysis was yet to be forged. So preliminary communication is communication before Freud started the use of the word unconscious. It is that period of work where Freud was yet to come upon the concept of ego defenses. It is before the structure of the mind. So we see how the master was fumbling here with a multitude of facts before him, trying to figure out what are the principles at work, how to go about it. And therefore, this is one of the earliest proto writings in psychoanalysis before psychoanalysis actually could be formed as a discipline with clearly laid out principles and theories. So in that sense, it's a very important historical space where in a proto form, we find emergence of psychoanalysis.
What is the central point of this preliminary communication?
The central point of preliminary communication is a central point of psychoanalysis in general. And that is that there is a distinct category of sicknesses which are primarily psychological sicknesses. We discussed in one of our previous discussions that if you divide all the sicknesses based upon their causality, you will have a few categories of sicknesses. The first category, physically driven. Say I have an accident. A car bumps into me and breaks my bones. A very physical event. Then you can have attack by a pathogen, say COVID. A second category of sickness. Third category, I was born, let us say somebody is born with a genetic deformity. So the genetic category. Fourth category, lifestyle disease, functional disorder. And fifth category, let us say, diseases which are primarily psychological in origin. So the central point of preliminary communication and of psychoanalysis is that there is a category of sicknesses which are primarily psychological in origin, and the best way to treat them is psychological. And often these psychological sicknesses may have distinct biological manifestations, which we call psychosomatic or conversion disorders. And there, it is better to take vantage point in psychology than in neurochemistry. And in this category of sicknesses, the mind is like the CPU and the body is like the computer monitor. That on the monitor, what we see is only a display of what is actually happening in the CPU. So it's better to go into the CPU than to be obsessed with the monitor. Because this is only a derivative, a consequence of what is happening in the CPU. So that is one central point of preliminary communication. The second central point of preliminary communication has to do with existence of a part of the mind. So the second important point of preliminary communication is that there exists a part of the mind which is outside of our awareness and control. And in that part of the mind, all that goes on in the conscious mind also goes on. So what happens in that part of the mind is there is desires, there is thinking, there is generation of emotions, there is defensive action, and all sorts of things go on in that part of the mind. So this is a second central point of preliminary communication, that we seem to come upon a part of the mind which is autonomous of our conscious mind, which is outside of our awareness and control, where all the psychological activities like in the conscious mind go on, which is not working exactly according to the principles of the conscious mind, where the hold of the reality and morality is much less compared to that in the conscious mind. And what happens there can create a nucleus of a psychological sickness which can go on for years, almost for life, unless it is attended to where it actually is located. So this is the second important part. And the third important part is that there is a tendency in the mind of two things. Something, when some event happens, there is a memory of that event which has two components, cognitive and affective. And the affective component over a period of time erodes itself. There is a self-erosion tendency to much of our memory. But when a memory is loaded with feelings or affect beyond a certain quantum, that eroding property no longer is at play. And such memories almost remain forever intact with almost the same strength without any erosion of the feeling strength over a period of time. So this is a very third important component of the way the mind works. And that is how pathologies can go on for years, probably for the whole of life. And the fourth central component is that once you have a nucleus of this type, which is not self-eroding, then either it can directly manifest in terms of a symptom, or it may collect other such entities which are non-eroding and put them together and create an elaborate constellation. And the symptoms may be so elaborate and so distant from the original core complex that we get into the metaphor of a tree. That imagine a tree, imagine an imaginary tree which can give 10 different fruits and 10 different flowers.
Okay.
But when you go from those fruits and flowers to the leaves, there is slightly more homogeneity. When you go to the branch, it is even more homogeneity. The trunk is only one. Maybe it can have two colors, but it is just one. It's not like branches, it is just one. May have two colors or three colors. But when you go to the root, it's only one with a single color. That kind of a metaphor is what we see in psychological sicknesses, and that is what Freud and Brewer saw in hysteria and its manifestation. The fourth important point of preliminary communication is that affect is labile, meaning feeling from one memory can be put onto another memory. And feeling from one memory can be discharged by expression or action directly or by displacement on some other action. So the storage, there is liability in the storage and there is liability in release. The fifth important component of preliminary communication is that unless the affect finds expression, the cure is not permanent. It's not enough to only bring the idea into the conscious. It is necessary to release the affect associated with the idea. Catharsis is the core component of healing.
Right.
So these are some of the central points of preliminary communication. And one more point, two more points, let me see. One is that of hypnoid states, which we'll slightly deal in a moment from now, that there are altered states of consciousness which come up, which are very distinct from the normal states of consciousness, and the two can coexist and activate and deactivate alternately. And the seventh point is of preliminary communication, that talking cure is possible. That without a neurochemical intervention, without a surgical intervention, cure of one category of sicknesses, which we call as psychological sicknesses, is possible. So these are some of the central points of preliminary communication. In today's context, it seems almost given. We are stating the obvious. But we must remember, at those times when it was written, all of these were path-breaking discoveries.
True. So coming to concepts, which Freudian concepts we see originating in preliminary communication?
In fact, a very large number, I would say almost 70% of Freudian concepts we see in prototype at a proto level in preliminary communication. First, the idea of the unconscious. Second, the idea of liability of affect. Third, the idea of non-eroding of certain complexes, which are highly endowed with feelings. Fourth, the significance of catharsis more than just the idea coming to the conscious. Fifth, the idea of defenses. Sixth, the idea of predisposition, which actually Freud did not go much into, but it is, the seeds are here. And we'll go into why Freud could not go into it. The predisposition to sickness. And the seventh is revisiting and going back into one's life psychologically and gaining relief therefrom. Seventh is the sickness being a communication of what is going on in the unconscious. And this will come to when we get into the 4 stages of hysterical attacks, as both of them saw. So if we look at the idea of unconscious, defenses, catharsis, childhood determination of long-standing pathology, the leaking out of the unconscious, the significance of reality and morality in control, all the core ideas which later on would become the core pillars of the Freudian edifice, we see in proto size, in a proto form in preliminary communication.
Can we go into the concepts of hypnoid states you just mentioned, reaction and abreaction?
Yeah, these 3 are very important concepts in preliminary communication. The hysterical state into which a person would go, and we must remember, we are talking of a time where Freud is still not using the word psychosis.
Okay.
So what we would call psychotic hallucination today, even that is termed under hysteria.
Okay.
So we are in the pre-DSM stage, a century before DSM almost, more than century probably. So we still don't have vocabulary that we use today. So what Freud and Brewer would think is this, that when the attack of hysteria comes, the person goes into a state of mind which is completely different from the way he normally behaves. And for that 15-20 minutes of that attack, whatever duration the attack continues, he's in a completely different state of mind. And often when he comes back to normalcy, he has no recollection of what he did. So there are almost like 2 separated states of mind. And this hysterical state of mind, what we would call today an altered state of consciousness, Freud and Brewer term as the hypnoid state. It was almost as though somebody has done a kind of a waking vertical hypnosis. And instead of splitting it into the conscious and the unconscious, vertically split the personality into the normal and the hypnoid. And the hypnoid is activated. And the normal is being deactivated. And when the normal is activated, the hypnoid is deactivated. So those altered states of consciousness of the hysterical attacks, Freud, especially the florid ones, Freud and Brewer termed as the hypnoid states. And the important aspect was that there seemed to exist 2 different, almost disjointed autonomous states in the same mind. And we are still before the word unconscious was used by Freud. So what we see is a split in the psyche, where one part of the psyche activates, the other deactivates, and both of them have no knowledge about each other. There is no integration of the 2 parts of the psyche. So these altered states are what Freud called as the hypnoid states. What was interesting was these hypnoid states were slightly different from the hypnotic state that Freud would induce in some of his patients. Because there, from a normal state, you are going into a state where the patient is in trance and you can do something to heal him. But in these hypnoid states, It was like everything was bursting out and there was little that you could do. And you could just wait till the hypnoid state is over. The reaction and abreaction were used by Freud in a way that if something happens to you, you react. That is normal. But for some reason, if you are not able to express yourself, that will lead to some pathological reaction inside, which would be abreaction. Often the abreaction would be acting out in some other way. And when the reaction and the abreaction both are completely stopped, the chances of getting a symptom, they go up. So at times the word abreaction was used to say that it is displacement of affect from one place to another and you are acting out in some other way. At times abreaction was absence of reaction so that the affect is built up. So the two ways in which this has been used, and what is important is that Freud does mention there that why a person is not able to react. One, there is too much of morality or reality. Or two, there is no event outside, it is only an event inside, and therefore only morality is at play. And this is very important, that this is where the proto-existence of a fantasy-driven pathology comes in. That Freud mentions very clearly that how does such an affect develop which cannot be expressed out directly or indirectly. And Freud says either the event happens in which somebody who is perpetrating a trauma is closely related and therefore is loved and respected and therefore cannot be replied back in the same coin out of love or morality, or there is too much fear of the person in reality. That is one. The second part is that one can have a fantasy, and in fantasy huge amount of affect can be generated, and morality not permitting it to be expressed out, it accumulates inside and then forms a nucleus of difficulty. So there is a real trauma and there is a fantasized trauma. And later on, Freud took this fantasized trauma to a great extent. For example, Oedipus is one of the fantasized traumas. That in reality, nobody is attacking you. Everything is happening inside the mind, but you create a trauma. Often perceived abandonment is of that type. That in reality, nobody has abandoned you or even has an intention of abandoning you. But you perceive absence as abandonment. So you can have fantasized traumas as well as the real traumas. Now, some of these concepts later on Freud elaborates once he comes with the ideas of ego defenses and displacement, and they undergo change. So in later Freud, you don't see uses of the word reaction, abreaction, or the hypnoid states. They are very early Freud writings. Later Freud, you don't see these words.
So the hysterical attack was like a blanket term for many of the current disorders, mental disorders. And how was the hysterical attack deconstructed into its genetic constituent stages, as we do regularly these days for the different ailments in the DSM mentioned there? How
Um,
was it that back that time?
okay, there are two parts of it. One we'll deal right now, and one we'll deal in the subsequent discussion. The first is, how do you deconstruct at those times hysterical attacks into its constituent stages? And second, what all was covered under the word hysteria at that time?
Exactly. Yeah.
So in this question, let me just deal with the first part of the stages. And interestingly, both Freud and Brewer did not create their own description of stages. They actually used Charcot's description.
Okay.
And the Charcot's description divided a hysterical attack into four constituent stages. First was the stage of the epileptic fit. Second was the stage of large and wide convulsive movements of the body. Third was the hallucinatory phase. And fourth was the phase of the terminal delirium. Now, this is very foreign to us because we don't see those attacks anymore in that way.
Exactly.
So, this is very foreign to us. And this also brings us the whole idea of how psychological sicknesses can be historical in nature. But as the historical time changes, as the culture changes, you see advent of some new sicknesses and you see demise of many sicknesses. So the socio component comes in there. That it is not strictly biological or family rooted. There is a large social component to psychological sickness. Because we don't see those patients anymore, where the four stages can be seen. I wonder if any psychotherapist who has been practicing after 2000 has actually seen all the four stages.
In the
So,
rural areas, we still see them.
yeah, rural area we still see this, yes, correct. But in the modern metro
Urban area.
urban
Yeah.
area, we don't see those cases. In rural areas, we see it, and in where the mystics and shamans heal, there we see it.
Yes, absolutely right.
So the four stages were, first was epileptic fit kind of thing. The second was large gyrating movements of the body, which were by and large, obviously, majority of them were sexual or aggressive, mostly sexual. The third was hallucinations, which today we would separately call psychosis, schizophrenia, and all sorts of things. But hallucinations were there. The fourth was delirium. Now, the delirium today would be very important because it would leaking out of the unconscious. Because if you look at the whole attack, it's almost like a leaking out of the unconscious in a distorted form. So these were the four stages Charcot had found, and both of them, Freud and Brewer, continued with the use of the same stages. At this stage also, they were not interpreting the gyrating movements as sexual or the delirium as leaking out of the unconscious. That would happen slightly later.
Are you adding some more to it, sir?
Right.
Or
Done with the done.
okay. All right. So, if we go further into it in terms of specifics, which were the hysteric manifestations Freud and Freud were dealing with and referring to?
Hysteria at that time was a category term, not one particular sickness.
Exactly.
So neuralgias, all the pains, all kinds of paralysis, all kinds of going mute, all kinds of forgetting, amnesias, all kinds of hallucinations, all kinds of conversion psychosomatic sicknesses, and all kinds of bizarre behavior. Everything would be put under the category word hysteria. So they were using this word to cover all of this, which today we'll find in different chapters of DSM.
So was it not neurotic, psychotic, and histrionic, or it was just histrionic at that time?
At that time, it was only hysteria. Later on, it would deconstruct into neurosis and psychosis, and thereafter neurosis, borderline, and psychosis. But at that time, it was just a category word to cover this range of difficulties, psychological sickness.
Some mention of the two core roots of the genesis of a hysterical complex. Can we unpack it?
There are certain elements, they are very interesting, even in preliminary communication. The first is, Freud says that either there was such a action from outside or inside, either a attack from outside or a fantasy from inside, that affect generated was so high that the traumatic neurosis could be formed. That is one. The second root, very interestingly, Freud says, which I think we have not gone in details later also, that